Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, Bound for Mexico, exploring the wintering grounds of the monarch butterfly. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Charlie Reinertsen. I'm your host, Rob Bess. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks, Rob, and welcome everyone to today's chat. I'll do my best to try and transport us to the wintering grounds of the monarch butterfly. This picture here is taken up in the transvolcanic mountains of central Mexico, which is the location that monarch butterflies spend their winter. So we'll talk about the ecology of the monarch butterfly, the natural history, and we will try to see what it's like to be in this place where they spend their winters. A little bit about me: I'm a photographer, writer, and guide, and I've had the incredible opportunity to explore a lot of ecosystems all around the world, including the opportunity to guide in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem with Natural Habitat Adventures, and most recently in the wintering grounds of the monarch butterfly. Working with Natural Habitat Adventures is a really fun opportunity for me to get out of the office, because a lot of what I do through my company, Two Line Studio, is working with clients to develop their communications and marketing. And then I also have projects like the Northern Peatlands project that get me out in the field photographing our northern peatlands, and then this work with Natural Habitat Adventures that gets me out in the field and immersed in all of these natural phenomena that I'm writing and talking about through my other work. So we'll just do monarch ecology today. We'll take a look at the trip itinerary that Natural Habitat Adventures offers, and we'll also dive into the conservation story of the monarch butterfly. But before we do all of that, I just thought it would be nice to start with some video clips that I've taken in my backyard, because most likely your experience with monarch butterflies has been in your own backyard. And that was my experience with monarch butterflies until a year ago now. Natural Habitat Adventures knew that I had a huge interest in this area, and they asked me to be able to do this trip last year. And so I studied as much as I could, and then I was able to go down and visit the wintering grounds. And what's neat about that is my backyard is in the northernmost range of the monarch butterfly. I'm calling in from Saranac Lake, New York, in the Adirondacks, which the monarch butterflies go just a little bit further north than here, up into Canada, before they turn around and make their southward migration. So just give me a second here. I'm going to pull up another screen so that I can show you what it's like in my backyard in the summer. So there's no sound to this video, and before I get started here, I'm just going to drop this in the chat, because if you would, let's see, type the message here to organizers and panelists. Let's see if that shows up for you. And hopefully that'll show up. I just dropped the link to this video because while I'm streaming here, it might be a little bit challenging for the streaming to be able to keep up. The video will be a little bit chunky, but we'll go into full screen mode and see if we can go from there. Just want to make sure that we have all of this ready to go. All right, so this footage is a lot of macro photography as well as drone footage from my backyard. We're really lucky in that we have all these beautiful milkweed gardens. Some of the first flowers to come up are lupin, and then eventually the milkweed comes in as well. And this is the primary food source of the monarch butterfly in its caterpillar larval stage. So just getting a few shots here. There are other bugs that also rely on milkweed as a food source, but we'll talk about why that's really unique as we get into the ecology of the monarch butterfly. So some of these critters might be familiar to you if you've spent time in milkweed gardens. This grasshopper, just before this, we were seeing a milkweed beetle. This guy right here, the iridescent one, the red one is a different type of milkweed beetle. And here is dogbane. So this is a flower, this is the dogbane beetle right here. And they exclusively feed on dogbane, but that's also in the milkweed family. And all of these plants produce what's called a latex that contains a cardiac glycoside, which is a very toxic chemical, but the monarch butterfly has adapted to be able to handle that. Here you're taking a close-up look at monarch butterfly eggs, which then hatch into a larval caterpillar. These caterpillars, their biggest job is to feed and eat on the milkweed leaves. We'll talk about all of this at a much more comfortable pace, but I just wanted to give you a little something to listen to while you're looking at this footage. So these might be scenes that you're familiar with when it comes to the monarch butterfly. So here, this last look here is starting to think about that monarch butterfly taking off and flying. You know, it's just amazing to me that they can live in this habitat in the summer and then make their way 2,500, maybe 3,000 miles south to a very, very small section of forest in Michoacan, Mexico. So that's just a little teaser there. And we'll just go ahead and dive into some monarch ecology before we take a look at the wintering grounds of this species. So to understand the monarch butterfly, we really have to understand the life cycle of this species. So the monarch butterfly, the female butterfly, will lay about 400 eggs on milkweed leaves. And you're seeing a picture of that egg here. And they choose milkweed because they have a very special relationship with this plant. And they're able to eat this plant despite the fact that it has cardiac glycosides within the latex, which is a gluey substance that this plant produces. This plant is producing that because they're trying to deter animals from eating it. And yet the monarch butterfly has adapted ways to be able to sequester those toxins within their tissues, and it makes them so that prey or predators do not want to eat them. And there's a lot of studies showing that birds that try to eat monarch butterflies will regurgitate them, they'll throw them up, and that helps the predators learn to avoid this species. And the color of the monarch butterfly, this orange color, is a warning color. It tells the predators, hey, stay away. They'll remember that for the next time so that they don't feed on the monarch butterfly. Here you're getting a look at the milkweed blossoms just before they bloom. So those are just the buds. And then you're seeing the larva accomplishing its first job, which is to eat that egg casing, because that is the safest meal that caterpillar is going to have. Even though these caterpillars can handle the toxins, the cardiac glycosides that are within the milkweed leaf, it still is a costly and dangerous task for them to feed on these leaves. When they first make an incision in the leaf, they do it very carefully, and then they allow that latex to ooze out, and they actually are draining the leaves to make it easier to eat the leaf now that it's drained of latex. And these cardiac glycosides in a typical animal, they would cause cardiac arrest, or at the very least, they would cause extreme sickness in that animal. And so in this instance, they are able to feed successfully. I just want to do a quick check here on making sure that my screen is sharing. the right thing. It seems like maybe it's not on the right screen, so just gonna go back here. Thank you for your patience. There it is. Looks like it's on the right one right now. Possibly it was already there, but we're taking a look at these caterpillars here. So the idea here is that these creatures, these monarch butterfly larvae, have evolved to be able to eat exclusively milkweed plants, and that gives them a chemical defense against predators. And what you're seeing here in this image on the left is actually 5 different instars, and those are growth stages of that caterpillar. So once they hatch from an egg, they eat as much as they can and they grow, and then they shed their exoskeleton and enter the next instar. And a healthy monarch butterfly will move through all 5 of these stages, and the 5th stage, they'll eat as much as they possibly can to put on as much weight as possible and eat as many nutrients to prep them for the next stage of their life, which is this great transformation. And this is the forming of a chrysalis so that they can go through this phase of metamorphosis and emerge as an adult butterfly. Now, this whole life cycle from egg to larva to hatching from their chrysalis takes roughly a month and a half to 2 months, depending on the temperature. At lower temperatures, all of this proceeds a little bit more slowly, and at hotter temperatures, this moves a little bit more quickly. That's an important stat to remember because soon we're going to start talking about the winter ecology of this species. Now, this particular species, monarch butterflies, are found all the way around the globe. It is actually a tropical species that evolved around the equator and then dispersed from there. And this species evolved in a very close relationship with milkweed, and we actually call that an evolutionary arms race, in which one species has been evolving to have defenses against other species, and then that next species evolves to be able to handle those defenses. So in this case, the milkweed evolved to have toxins that prevent herbivory or predators from eating their plant material. And then the monarch butterfly is evolving to be able to handle those toxins. And so this is what we call a specialist relationship. These butterflies are relying exclusively on that food source during that larval stage. When they're adults, they can feed on any nectar plant to be able to give them energy, but when they're in their larval caterpillar stage, that's why milkweed is so important. Now, when we're hearing headlines about the monarch butterfly being endangered and threatened, we actually are only hearing about the migratory monarch butterfly. Because again, this species is found all the way across the world, but as far as we know, it is only migrating in 2 locations. One location is on the eastern seaboard of North America, and the other location is on the western seaboard. So there's a small migratory population in California that migrates down to the coast in the winter. And then there is a very large population from the Rocky Mountains all the way out to the East Coast and all the way up into Canada, that all of those butterflies funnel down into one particular place in Mexico for the winter. Now, this has been and continues to be somewhat of a mystery in terms of why have these butterflies evolved to migrate. There are other butterfly species that overwinter, even in places like where I am now in Saranac Lake, New York, where it gets brutally cold in the winter. There are a lot of butterflies that will effectively hibernate over winter and then emerge in the spring. But in roughly 1960s, 1970s, there were some ecologists in the United States who were out in the woods looking for monarch butterflies in the winter to figure out what are they doing. Are they overwintering in their adult form? Are they overwintering as caterpillars? Do they overwinter as a chrysalis? They were trying to figure out where they went. Now, in Mexico, many people, in particular indigenous people, knew that monarch butterflies were all congregating in one particular place. But at that time, scientists in the scientific community did not know about that. And so once these researchers started to look into this question, they were really starting to try and figure out what this mystery was. So we'll come back to that in a little bit, but the general idea here is that why did this migration come to be? Biologists believe that monarch butterflies, remember, they evolved in the tropics in that equatorial region around the Earth. And as the summer season moved on in the Northern Hemisphere, milkweed became very abundant in those areas. And so monarch butterflies would start to follow the milkweed abundance into those more northern climates. And then as the cold temperatures came around, the monarch butterflies would come back south because they are cold intolerant. If these creatures are at 32 or below for more than 24 hours, and in particular, if they get wet in those conditions, they will not survive. And so those monarch butterflies will move back down to their southernmost environment to be able to survive the winter. The other theory here that's driving this particular migration is parasite avoidance. Monarch butterflies in the tropics have a lot of parasites that feed on both the larva and the adult phase of the monarch butterfly. And so the idea is if you're in one location all the time, parasite populations can grow and grow and grow and take over. But if you migrate and move locations throughout the year and then come back down to your home, the idea is that the parasites would be left behind as those populations continue to move north and then come back south. So those are some theories around why this population exists in terms of, you know, we've got monarch butterflies all around the world, but these are the only places where they migrate. And so here is another graphic from monarchwatch.org. If you're looking for a place to find more information on monarch butterflies, definitely check them out. This is a great map showing those two pathways, the green arrows showing the summer migration from spring into summer moving north, and then the orange arrows representing the fall migration, and the wintering grounds are that small, tiny star down there in blue in central Mexico. Here's another map that simply traces the spring and summer migration of the population east of the Rocky Mountains. And one of the things to highlight here is that, and this is a hard one to kind of wrap our heads around, but essentially in the spring and summer, so starting in March, monarch butterflies will start to leave their overwintering grounds and they will start to migrate north. The first generation of those monarchs will make it about to Texas. Then those butterflies will lay eggs, and those eggs will develop and then hatch and all, go through the full life cycle until adult, and then those adults will fly further north and lay down the next generation. So they do this generational northward migration all the way until September, when environmental triggers cause them to turn around and head back south. So the butterflies that are making the migration in September have never been to the overwintering grounds in Mexico. So that's just an amazing point that I like to try and hold on to. That last generation, generations 4 and 5 that are existing in September, they start to detect seasonal changes, and this triggers them to start to make that southward migration. These seasonal triggers can be cold weather. It is the amount of daylight. Butterflies actually have a internal clock. They're actually able to perceive the length of time during the day chemically, essentially. And that tells them as the days get shorter in the northern hemisphere, it actually triggers them to start making that southern migration. And the third way that they're detecting this shift is through the plants that they're feeding on, both the nectar and the leaf material that they're eating as larvae. The chemical composition of those plants is changing as they die back, and essentially they're getting less nutritious. And so these monarch butterflies are detecting that, and that's also triggering them to start to make this southward migration. for them to be able to make this journey. And I tried to remind myself of this as I was heading down to Michoacan, Mexico last year. I was boarding the plane and I was thinking about the fact that an individual butterfly was about to make the same journey that would take me a 2-hour drive, a 3-hour plane ride, a 4-hour bus ride, another covered truck drive, and then eventually I would be able to hike to the place where they were able to fly in roughly a month. So that alone, as I was making that trek to be able to get down to their wintering grounds, I just kept thinking about this half-gram insect that somehow is able to make it down to this very specific, very small location to be able to survive the winter, to be able to come back to their feeding grounds in the summer. And I still haven't been able to wrap my head around it. But this map here starts to kind of hone in on some of the winter sanctuaries where these butterflies exist. And to be able to make that journey, they have to go into effectively a different body type. So it's what we call reproductive diapause, where they shut down their reproductive organs, they increase their fat storage, and then this is the amazing part. Remember when I said their lifespan is about 1.5 to 2 months from egg to dead? Now, this butterfly that is in this state of reproductive diapause is able to live for 7 months, just the adult form. And it is doing that because it is going into this reduced level of activity in this perfect microclimate that we'll talk about in just a minute. But before we get to the wintering grounds, which I promise we'll get there, let's figure out how they're doing this. So we have a lot of theories, and there are a lot of researchers who are still trying to confirm the different ways that monarch butterflies are getting to this tiny location in the mountains in central Mexico without ever having been them as an individual. One way is that circadian clock that I was talking about earlier. So they actually have hormones that are within their body that are regulated by the amount of daylight that they are exposed to. So essentially they know roughly what time of day it is, and they can also determine the position of the sun over the horizon. So they're using both the time of day and the position of the sun with their internal compass to be able to put a bearing and be able to travel in a particular direction. And the next area that's really interesting that researchers are studying is magnetic field detection. So they have these small deposits of magnetite on their bodies, and that magnetite is believed to be helping them perceive magnetic fields of our poleward magnetism, to be able to also use that to navigate with as they get their bearing moving south, basically southwest. And then what's really interesting is that the particular place where they're headed, these transvolcanic mountains in central Mexico, there are actually magnetic disruptions that are caused by those mountains that throw off compasses because of all the heavy metals that are in these volcanic mountain ranges. And it's believed that that is one of the last signals that helps the butterflies hone in on their particular location to be able to get back home. Once they get really close to the areas where they like to roost in the winter, the scientists believe they're using sight and actually seeing particular geographical markers that are helping them hone in on the location. And then they're also using smell. So they have, like many insects, the ability to smell pheromones, which are essentially these chemicals that they release that communicate different information to fellow insects, to fellow monarch butterflies. And there are chemical signatures that each individual has. And it's believed that these monarch butterflies are using that chemical signature to actually hone in on the particular forest and perhaps even the particular tree that their ancestors used to be able to survive the winter. So why are they going to this one very specific place in central Mexico? This place is at about 10,000 feet, so you're very high up, and you're in a very arid, typically warm place. But what this produces is a fairly steady microclimate. So at 10,000 feet elevation, the temperature range is between about 40 and 60 degrees in the winter. And that means that these butterflies can stay at a very low level of energy because their number one objective at this point in time at their life stage is simply to survive and have enough energy in terms of fat storage to be able to power their flight back on that journey northward to about the region of Texas to lay those eggs for the next generation of monarch butterflies. So they're essentially just waiting out the winter until milkweed becomes really abundant again so that they can start that next life cycle. So these oyamel fir forests in Michoacan, Mexico are the perfect place to be able to find that. As I mentioned, there were a lot of researchers in the United States and other places who were starting to try to figure out what was happening to monarch butterflies. And in the 70s, researchers were able to find the wintering grounds of monarch butterflies. Again, if you were to talk to locals and if you were to be paying attention to the indigenous communities there, they already knew that these monarch butterfly populations existed. It was simply the scientific community that was catching up. And so this issue of National Geographic is showing Lisa Bauer, who was related to one of the, she and her husband were researchers who worked on discovering this and then studying the monarch butterfly. And this particular issue of National Geographic is announcing the discovery of these wintering grounds. As we're looking at that map of the southern migration, it's happening about in September, October, November, and the arrival to the wintering grounds happens about in November, which coincides with the Day of the Dead celebration. And it's believed that the monarch butterflies are the souls of the departed returning home. So a lot of cultural history here tied in as well. This is just a closer look at a number of the butterfly sanctuaries that are within the larger Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. So the Butterfly Biosphere Reserve is that yellow area on the map, and that is designated conservation land by Mexico. And then you can see here there's political boundaries of Michoacan and the state of Mexico, where you can find the butterfly locations where they overwinter. Now, before we go into the next phase of this presentation, I'll risk opening up another video and maybe having this go haywire again, but just give me a moment to be able to switch over to a video of being down there last winter. So this, here we go. Again, there's no sound, so I'll just describe what we're looking at as we go. And afterwards, I'll drop a link in the chat so that you can watch this as well. This is looking up at branches that are filled with monarch butterflies. It is so hard in pictures and video to be able to communicate what it means to be able to see this congregation, this gathering of insects. Those trees are covered, all of the bark is covered in monarch butterflies. The branches that would normally be pointing up are falling down with the weight of all of the butterflies. And when the sun hits these dense congregations of butterflies, the butterflies start streaming off in rivers. And right now they're getting a drink at a stream, they're drinking nectar. And like I said, their objective is simply to be very low energy and just survive until the spring, when they'll start to mate, even in these wintering grounds, which we're seeing a few individuals that are in flight that are mating in this video if you look really closely. And here's a staircase where you would actually be able to walk up and see those butterflies. So let me just get back to our presentation here. Just give me a moment. So there was a lot there in that short video, but we'll go through some pictures that we'll take our time with and try and describe what it's like to be within the sanctuary. So here's a picture of one of our Natural Habitat Adventures guests, and he's looking out into the forest, and you're seeing these huge clusters of monarch butterflies in the oyamel fir forest. Here we're looking out through a window of trees, and all of those dots in the sky are also monarch butterflies. When you get to this particular location and you're surrounded by all of these insects, there's really no way to describe it. When you first get there for the very first time, it's almost hard to understand what you're looking at. And even now, looking back at these pictures, it just kind of puts me back in that moment where it's just hard to wrap your head around. And one of the things biologically to speak about is that we're looking at these oyamel fir trees in this picture, and the one in the center of the frame is completely covered with butterflies. And overnight, the temperatures drop, and so the butterflies cluster together to stay warm. And they're also clustering around on the tree itself, because those trees are kind of like hot water bottles in your sleeping bag. If you've ever been camping in cold weather, you've brought in a hot water bottle that holds on to the heat very well throughout the night. And these trees are similar to that. Whereas the air will be really cold temperature, the trees hold on to the heat that they've accumulated throughout the day, and they slowly release that overnight. So these butterflies are able to stay warm on those trees. And so that actually ties into another piece, that it's really important that we have some really large diameter trees, because the larger the diameter of the tree, the more this thermal effect takes place. As I mentioned while we were watching the video, what the weather is doing that day is going to dictate the types of behaviors that you see in the Butterfly Biosphere Reserve. So on a cold day, they'll be clustered up. On a warm day with a lot of sun and not very much wind, the butterflies will actually start to fly. And the part of the reason why they're doing that is that they've gotten enough thermal energy to be able to do so. But the other reason is that they're actually cooling off. So you'll see the butterflies fly up and then slowly float down through the air column. And that's cooling them off, because if they get too warm, they're effectively they start burning off too much of the stored sugars that they have that are going to need to power them through surviving the winter and then flying north. On a cool day, this is what it looks like. If you can look into this picture, you're seeing those big clusters of butterflies both weighing down the branches of the trees and covering the bark of the trees themselves. Absolutely mind-boggling to be able to see this. And if you're lucky enough to be there on a warm, sunny day, which can happen anytime from January all the way through until March, you might be able to see something like this. So this is looking straight up. It was just a river of butterflies. And this happened really quickly. 1 minute, it was looking like this with all the trees coated in butterflies. And then all the butterflies got just warm enough, just at the right moment, and the sky just exploded. And you could literally hear the wing beats of those butterflies. Like I said, in the wintering grounds, they're also feeding on nectar. As they are here, they're drinking water, and they are flying to cool themselves down. In their wintering grounds, there are actually a number of predators that can feed on them. If you think about it, this is just an amazing food source. And if you can figure out how to sequester the toxins or process the toxins, you've got it made in the oyamel fir forest from November until March. And in this photo right here, you see that wedge taken out of the wing of the monarch butterfly. And most likely that's from one of the birds that actually feeds on this particular species. So it could have been a black-backed oriole, or the other bird species that feeds on them that's escaping me at this very moment. And the other species that feeds on them is actually a mouse. And in the early spring, these butterflies will start to mate before they migrate north. And what's important to note here is that as they mate, the male is not only delivering sperm, but also a spermatophore. And that spermatophore is essentially a gift of a lot of sugars and carbohydrates to be able to help power the female butterfly to be able to make that first leap north during that first generation to lay her eggs much further north and to find milkweed availability in about the region of northern Mexico into Texas before the generational hop as they go further north. So with just a few more minutes here, I would love to just kind of run through what it looks like on the Natural Habitat Adventures itinerary. And it essentially is a round trip with a focus on Mexico City as the city of transit. So guests arrive in Mexico City, they can come early to be able to have their own time there. We don't spend any time in Mexico City other than just a quick meeting in our hotel to be able to talk about what we're going to see on the trip, kind of like what I've been doing today. And then we head to Angongeo. And that drive takes about 4 hours to be able to make our way all the way to Angongeo. And we take a charter bus to be able to get there. Along the way, the guides talk about the history of that area and what we're about to see. Because once we get to the sanctuaries, we're so immersed in the moment and we don't want to disturb that really peaceful, quiet time. And actually, when you're really directly in the place where you're surrounded by butterflies, you're actually supposed to stay very, very quiet. So we try to do a lot of our education and prep before we get to that particular location. Now, day one is a visit to El Rosario. So again, we made it to Angongeo the day previous, or we make it to Angongeo and then we load up in these covered trucks and they take us up the mountain. And then we hop on a horseback ride, and then that gets us to the trailhead. And depending on where the monarch butterflies are at that particular time, we then go for a hike that could be 30 minutes and it could be an hour. It could be fairly flat or it could be very steep, and it all depends on where the butterflies are and where the trails are to be able to access the particular location. Because the butterflies, while they choose a very small section of woods to be spending the winter, they do throughout the winter kind of move throughout that ecosystem. And so the trails have to move with them to be able to find where they are. So here are some pictures of guests enjoying El Rosario, which is one of the sanctuaries. And then on the evening, we have a sunset stop on the way back to our lodging in Angongeo. Something that makes this trip particularly special is that all of the people who we hire and work with, from the manager and owner of the hotel to all the people that work there to the various restaurants that we visit during this time, everyone is just incredibly friendly. If you know some Spanish, it goes such a long way to be able to talk with them, and it just brings a big smile to everyone's face. So the people that you meet beyond just the travelers that you're with and the guides that you're with, the people from these places, Angongeo and in the butterfly biosphere reserves, they're just really special people, and it's really wonderful to get to know them through this trip as well. On the second day, we go to Sierra Cinque. This is another biosphere reserve sanctuary. And we once again take our horseback ride to be able to get up the mountain, and then we hike that last section to be able to get to where you can see the butterflies. And depending on the day, if it's a warm day, you might see butterflies all the way. You know, as soon as you get to the horseback ride, you might be seeing butterflies, and that is a pretty magical experience as well. Day two, we have lunch actually within the Sierra Cinque Reserve, and then we make our way back to Angongeo, which is a town that has really embraced the ecotourism that's taking place for the monarch butterfly. And so there's a lot of history of the town. It used to be a mining town and a forestry town, And some of the forestry operations still exist, but mostly it has transitioned over to supporting this ecotourism and the monarch butterfly sanctuaries. On day 3, we actually go back to El Rosario, and that is intentional because we want to give ourselves the most opportunity for different types of behavior within these sanctuaries. And this particular sanctuary has the highest count of butterflies within it year after year. There's a lot of population data that we're relying on for those stats. And it's just a really special place. And here you're seeing some guests walk down the steps. And this was just a warm afternoon, and the butterflies were just cascading down the mountain, following us as we exited the sanctuary. Here's another photo of just looking up at a tree filled with them, and as they're streaming off in the really warm afternoon light. Just a spectacular time. It's really, you know, everybody has a different response to it, and there's enough time and space for everyone to be able to kind of move through this experience at their own pace and be able to process it in their own time, because for me, at least, it was a lot to wrap my head around to be able to understand what I was looking at, even after having researched and spent so much time learning about it. It's something that you can't understand, you know, really wrap your head around until you're there. And we definitely provide a lot of time to be able to absorb that. On the next day, we leave the sanctuaries and make our way to Valletta Bravo, where we have a number of hikes, and we try to find some cultural attractions. There's one in Toluca that's absolutely gorgeous to be able to spend some time as we make our way back to Mexico City. And this is a fairly tight itinerary. You know, it's a 5-day itinerary, which is great. You get a lot of time in the sanctuaries packed in for a fairly short trip. So it's a really nice not-have trip to be able to see a lot on a short travel schedule. And of course, these trips, you know, it makes me particularly proud to guide for NatHab because of the partnership with World Wildlife Fund. And World Wildlife Fund in particular has done a ton of conservation work in the Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, and was really involved heavily during the time when the reserve was being set up and established. And so now we'll just talk a little bit about the conservation status of this species before we take some questions in the last couple minutes. So here's the scary chart. This is looking back. On the far left, you have 1991 as the, or sorry, 1993 as the year, and then on the far right, 2021. I'll have to update this graph to be able to include the most recent numbers. But on the left, what you're seeing, the way that we extrapolate the population of the monarch butterfly is by measuring the amount of land that they are occupying. So this is not a measure of the population. This is a measure of how much land the butterflies are occupying every winter from December until January. So that's the y-axis. And what you're seeing is a population spike around 1996, 97, and then a really steep decline trend over time. Here's the good news. While we do have the migratory monarch butterfly listed on the endangered red list, and again, that's the migratory population, because monarch butterflies are not endangered. They're around the world everywhere, but they only migrate here, and we're talking about the migratory butterflies. But the good news is that illegal logging has been reduced to almost none. So initially, illegal logging was a huge contributing factor towards removing habitat that they needed to be able to survive the winter. Without those oyamel forests, oyamel fir trees, the butterflies cannot survive up in those high mountain locations, and that causes big die-off events. So this is a huge area of conservation success, and it is in huge part due to Mexico, the state, the government itself, and then also due to the landowners. So these particular butterfly biosphere reserves are owned by ejidatarios, the landowners themselves. And these people have stepped up and started to create reforesting programs where they are planting native trees, and they've moved towards sustainable, horticulture, where they're growing their crops on site rather than relying on income from forestry. And then they're leaning heavily into ecotourism, which is essentially giving them a new source of income so that they don't have to harvest trees or do things that might damage the habitat to be able to make a livelihood. So just going back to this graph, this is a chart showing how much forest degradation in the core monarch butterfly biosphere reserve has happened from 2001 until 2019. So you're seeing all of a sudden in 2016, when a lot of laws came into place, this huge, sorry, I'm reading that wrong, 2010, this huge drop in logging. And from now on, what you're seeing is some instances of illegal logging where people do not have permission to cut the trees, and that is getting reduced year after year through various efforts. So now the big conservation mission is turning towards what's happening north of the migratory, the wintering grounds of the migratory butterfly. So really we're looking at what's happening when the butterfly goes into the United States. And there are a lot of places where agricultural land that relies on heavy use of herbicides and pesticides, those types of operations are just decimating both milkweed that the monarch butterfly relies on to eat, and also just directly killing insects, including monarch butterflies. So this is the part of the story that's really interesting, because monarch butterflies are this charismatic species that a lot of people have had a direct relationship with. They've seen them in their gardens. They're really dramatic, they're bright, they're beautiful. And so it's kind of this poster child for conservation. The cool thing about this is that if we start to conserve habitat for monarch butterflies, it will also conserve habitat for all of the other pollinating species that rely on that same type of habitat. So you can get involved a number of different ways. You can plant native milkweed. You can provide nectar plants that the adult butterflies need to power their flight south. And you can limit your mowing to be able to promote native species in your area. Supporting beneficial farming practices that don't use pesticides and herbicides is another huge way. So thinking about where you're getting your food from and seeing if you might be able to shift it. And then also supporting monarch habitat conservation. Those are some very straightforward ways to be able to help this migration. And with that, I'd love to kind of open up for questions. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me, charlie@twoline.com. And you can also follow me on Instagram at Two-Line Studio. And that's the name of my company where I do a lot of marketing and communications work for clients, and where you'll also find all of my work on the Northern Peatlands Project, which is documenting one of the rarest and most remote ecosystems on the planet. So please get in touch. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks for your interest in the monarch butterfly. I'd love to open it up for just a couple questions here before we reach the top of the hour.
All right, thank you so much, Charlie. Now, before we start with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. One of our guests is curious about the western population of the monarch butterflies, which crashed by maybe about 90% a few years ago. Do we know what caused this?
I'd have to look into the exact reasons for the crash. If my memory serves me, I believe that it was a particularly harsh winter. If you remember, monarch butterflies can't survive below 32 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 24 hours. And in particular, if they get wet and then cold, that will be the end of them. So if I remember right, I think that it was a really harsh winter that caused that. But this is, as much as that's a scary stat, I also find hope in that same exact thing because insects are so well positioned to have a comeback. You know, if we went back to that slide where you were seeing that downward trend, there were also some major jumps up and then a drop down and then a huge jump up and a drop down. And that comes down to the ecology of these species. Insects usually have the ability to lay hundreds of eggs. In the case of monarch butterflies, one individual can lay 400 eggs. And so if you think about it, if we have one good year where you have just perfect conditions throughout the summer for feeding on milkweed, and then they come down to the wintering grounds and have a great year, you can see a huge increase in population in one calendar year. So that's to me where I'm getting hope for the future of monarch, the migratory population of monarch butterflies. Yes, you can have these big crash years, but there's also hope that you can have, if we restore the habitat throughout its range, years where there can be a really big comeback as well.
Thank you for that. So one of our guests is curious if the oyamel furs are being logged legally at all.
Yeah, so there is, it's called sanitation cuts. So there are legal logging operations, and typically those are for safety purposes. So if there are trees that need to be dropped because they're near the trail where people are visiting the monarch butterflies, those have the ability to be removed. So those cuts are approved by the government and then the ejidatarios. And so there are instances where you can have timber removed, but those are very selective. They're not clear-cut operations. So the illegal timber cutting is when, right now, the way it's happening is with folks just kind of hiking in with backpacks and huffing in their chainsaws and coming and cutting trees that way. And so there are a number of efforts to be able to try and combat that right now. Yeah, great question.
So what happens to the male butterfly after it mates? Does it just die?
That's it. That's his last great act. It's not going to be an immediate death, but when you are walking through the reserve, no matter what time of year, you'll see a lot of butterflies kind of just start to fall down, and then they'll be on the ground, just kind of slowly moving. So often people will just kind of help pick them up and move them off of the trail so that they don't get stepped on. But yeah, butterflies are dying in the reserve, with regular occurrence. And the male butterflies, really, that their last job is to mate. And like I said, they're not going to die right away, but from there they just kind of burn off their fat reserves, and that's it for them.
Very interesting. But it's an effective life if it is short. So is it only the first generation of female butterflies that migrates north?
Let's see, let me wrap my head around that, and we'll go back to a map here. Got to go way back to the beginning of the presentation. There we are. Oh, we went too far. So for that first generation, we don't have, it's very hard to track individuals, but for the most part, from the wintering grounds, it's the female butterflies who are flying north. The males have really if they've mated, they have no motivation to fly north at that point. But if they haven't mated, they might also travel north until they have, and then they'll run out of energy and they'll die. But essentially, that first generation is primarily the females flying north, laying eggs, and then the next generation will spring up from that location and then fly north. And something interesting to note here is that not every if you looked at the trajectory of one 5-generation pathway, it might not make it all the way to Canada, but as a population, they are making it all the way to Canada. So some butterflies might spend all 5 of their generations in the green zone. Some butterflies will make it all the way to the orange zone, all the way up in the north. So it's not a cookie cutter pathway for every single butterfly. It's kind of this cascade migration where it kind of spreads north in a funnel and then makes its way back south.
Great, thank you. So there's been some talk of trying to convert some of the monarch land into farms, maybe avocado farms. Is that true? How well protected are the lands, and would it cause any safety issues for travelers?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question. I haven't read anything about that recently, so I need to look into that. But the Butterfly Biosphere Reserve and then the individual sanctuaries within it are under protections both of the national government, the state government, and then also the landowners, the ejidatarios. Here's the nuanced piece of that, right? Like, we are experiencing the changes of climate change, and where the butterflies are spending their winter now is not going to be where they spend their winter in 50 years. Because with the changes that are happening in climate change, the habitat will effectively change over time. It might shift to a more northern climate that is going to be cooler in the future. Essentially, like, the viable locations where you would find the oyamel fir ecosystem are not necessarily going to be where they are today. So some of the challenge of monarch butterfly conservation is not only setting up reserves where they should be right now, but then also predicting where the good climates are going to be so that in 50, 100, 200 years, they will always have an oyamel fir forest to go to that checks all the boxes of what they need. So then when you start getting into reforestation efforts, or even thinking about where should the boundaries be to be able to project that out, there are ecologists who are working on data models that will tell us, okay, here's everything we know about how weather is shifting. Here's where we predict good habitat to be. And then they're going to make recommendations to policymakers to say, hey, we should probably think about conserving this area as well, because we anticipate that that's going to be where the butterflies will be eventually. So all of that gets really, really hairy. You know, it's not a perfect science, but it is interesting, and it's a great question as well. But I'll look into that, the avocado farming as well. You know, land use, just like anywhere in the world, is an incredibly complex question of how we feed ourselves, how we support natural systems, and how we exist with all of these species and make sure that everyone has a home. So it's a really good conversation to be having, and glad to be a part of learning about it with all of you. So thanks for the question.
So Charlie, how physical is this trip? Should I bring my hiking poles?
Yeah, this, like I said, every time you visit one of the sanctuaries, the monarch butterflies might not be in the same location. So on one trip, you might have a very strenuous hike. On another trip, it might be less strenuous. But regardless, it is a hike. If trekking poles are something that you use when you're on a hike, I would highly recommend using them. But the biggest factor here is elevation, because you're at 10,000 feet elevation, and so everything gets harder. So the really important thing is not to overexert yourself in that environment. So you really want to just take a step. If you need a breather in between every step, that's totally okay. You just have to work your way up. The guides also hike with oxygen on the chance that it's needed, oxygen tanks. And so really it's about making sure that you're in pretty good physical shape and you're able to hike. And then you want to just make sure you're taking your time as you're climbing the steeper parts of the trail. There's some rocks in the trail. But like I said, it kind of depends on where the butterflies are. But you know, I think the travel specialist at Natural Habitat Adventures will be able to talk with you about your own fitness level and what it's like on the trails to be able to give you a better idea of what you might be able to pull off.
Great, thank you, Charlie. Unfortunately, that will be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for closing comments.
Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. The next week on Tuesday, I'm going to be doing a chat on photography specifically in these monarch butterfly grounds, because when I think back to the trips that I did last year, ever since then, I've been thinking about all the shots that I wish I had had and all the gear that I wish I had had to be able to tell a slightly different story. So I'll talk to you about tips and tricks for how to get great photos that you're looking for on Tuesday next week, right back here at the Daily Dose of Nature. So thank you all for tuning in and have a wonderful weekend.
Charlie, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.